Good afternoon. My name is Cherry Canovan and I'm a researcher at the University of Central Lancashire in the United Kingdom. My key research interest is in socio-economic barriers to accessing science education and careers. Today I'm delighted to be here to tell you about an ongoing study being conducted by my research group into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on primary age science teaching and learning in the UK context. I'm aware that ISSM 2021 has attracted delegates from many nations, so I'd like to take this opportunity to give you a little background into the structure of UK education and the place of science within that. UK compulsory education runs between the ages of 4 and 16, with children attending primary school from 4 to 11 and secondary school from 11 to 16. Half of young people progress to university at age 18. The four nations of the UK, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, have different educational systems, but in this talk we will henceforth concentrate on the situation in England, where around 85% of the population live. In England, primary schools technically teach three core subjects, English, maths and science, as well as a range of other subjects such as arts and humanities. However, because the government only mandates national testing in maths and English, there have long been concerns that science is neglected at primary level. In general, numbers of young people studying science is a perennial concern for the government, and many schemes aim to increase participation in the field, particularly amongst young women. However, as well as a gender divide, there is a marked socio-economic divide in who accesses science learning and careers, with the average person working in science disproportionately likely to be white, male, and from an affluent background. As a group, our research aims at understanding these socio-economic disparities in science and how to address them. This then is the background against which we found ourselves surveying nationwide school closures in March 2020, when more than 95% of young people suddenly found themselves thrust into remote home learning. Our immediate fear was that this situation might have a severe negative effect on primary level science, more than in other areas of the curriculum. This was for a number of reasons, including a tendency among schools to prioritise the teaching of maths and English, potential for science to be harder to teach at home, with availability of resources one possible issue, and families feeling less able to support learning in science than in other subjects. With these concerns in mind, we instituted a study of UK teachers and parents to investigate how science fared during the school closure period compared to other primary school subjects. Our study is ongoing. We returned to our participants during a second round of closures in early 2021 in order to see whether and how the situation had improved. As education slowly begins to return to normal over the coming year or years, we will continue to speak to teachers and families to assess the longer-term impacts of the events of the last 18 months. So let me now tell you about how we conducted the first phases of this survey. At the beginning of our study, we felt that it was vital to capture a contemporary record of how teaching and learning was affected during the lockdown period. So we therefore conducted two surveys, one of parents of primary age children and one of primary school teachers, during the full lockdown period of March to May 2020, after which some children, although by no means all, returned to school. And because of the great stress being experienced across society at the time of this survey, we decided to use a light touch approach. So we used short, fully anonymous online surveys and passive recruitment methods via social media. And it's important to acknowledge that this methodology had drawbacks. For example, participation was skewed towards those who had easy access to the internet. But we felt it was important to minimise any discomfort being experienced by respondents given the situation. So during this stage, which we refer to as phase 1, we received responses from 182 UK primary school teachers and 360 parents. So during academic year 2020 to 2021, we had intended to investigate the longer term effects of the closures of the previous session. However, in January 2021, at very short notice, the UK government announced a further period of closures, which lasted until March. We therefore took the decision to once again make a real-time record of the primary science situation, with a particular emphasis on whether lessons had been learned from the first round of closures. So accordingly, we returned to our Phase 1 parent and teacher participants and surveyed them about science teaching and learning using a similar methodology from the previous phase. And in Phase 2, we had a total of 100 responses, including 77 parents and 23 teachers. And at this point, I'd like to make a note on the terminology I'll be using. So closure period 1, or CP1, refers to the first phase of school closures in spring-summer 2020, while closure period 2, CP2, refers to closures in early 2021. Sadly, but unsurprisingly, the findings of both phases conducted so far have largely confirmed the hypothesis that primary science education would be disproportionately impacted by the move to remote learning. We found that maths and English were prioritised and that teachers found science hard to teach remotely. In Phase 1, our findings include the following. 36% of teachers said that work set was mainly maths and English. 30% said that pupils were given science tasks less than once a week or not at all, and 35% said pupils were given less science than in a normal week. Meanwhile, although the vast majority of parents told us that their child had been set maths and English work by school, only 2/3 had been set science, with not much more than half completing this. By the time we got to Phase 2, 10 months after the first closures, primary home learning was much better organised, and science benefited to some extent as a result. However, as can be seen from the diagram, despite this global improvement, science continued to lag behind maths and English. And there was still a high level of dissatisfaction among our parents. A depressing number of respondents stated that their child was being set no science work at all, and where provision was available, the quantity and quality was often criticised, as you can see in these examples from parents, for example, quantity of science provided only once a fortnight, or being sent a television channel video as content. And in closure period 2, we also asked parents whether their child had received catch-up provision when they returned to school after the first round of closures. And many said that catch-up activities had taken place, but these were mostly in maths and English. And as can be seen from the diagram, almost no parents were aware of any science catch-up work taking place. So it's clear from everything that I've said so far that the quantity and quality of science education that primary pupils received during the UK's 2 school closure periods was significantly poorer than their normal provision, and that the subject had disproportionately suffered when compared to maths and English. This can at least partly be explained by the fact that many teachers found it difficult to deliver science provision during closure periods. Our participants cited particular concerns in 3 areas: availability of resources in pupils' homes, families' access to the internet, and parental ability to support science learning. But our Phase 1 findings also showed us that there was another dimension to this problem. While science education had suffered across the board, there was an added detriment to pupils who were likely to have pre-existing low science capital, those from areas of lower socio-economic status, for example, or those whose parents had no background in science. So our Phase 1 data demonstrates this finding in a number of ways. Firstly, we asked teachers to describe the area that they taught in as being of low, moderate, or high deprivation. Those teaching in areas of high deprivation experienced significantly more difficulty in teaching science remotely than those in more affluent areas, citing concerns about availability of resource, internet, and parental ability, as previously mentioned. And as you can see here, teachers working in areas of high deprivation, almost 2/3 of them found it difficult to translate the science curriculum for home learning, whereas only about 1/3 of teachers in areas of low deprivation felt this. And as can be seen, teachers in areas of high deprivation were also much more likely to state that their pupils were engaging with science less often than they normally would than those in more affluent areas. At the other end of the scale, we saw in our parental survey data that some families with existing high science capital were able to take advantage of the lockdown situation to reinforce this. Our sample was skewed towards parents with higher levels of science education, and that's an inevitable result of the passive sampling methodology. And what we found was that some respondents were able to undertake sophisticated science activities at home. So you can see a little bit of the quote there, but I'm going to give you the full quote. One example of such responses included, "Grandma and Grandpa have been delivering science demonstrations via Zoom. We have briefly looked at chromatography, making an electrical current through potatoes, and we made a volcano using vinegar and bicarbonate." And another respondent said, "We extracted DNA from an onion. We wanted to show the children what DNA was." And you can see from those quotes that parents who had existing science capital were often able to provide their children with rich science learning experiences at home. And we also found that parents with post-compulsory science qualifications were much more comfortable in helping their children with school science. Okay, so that was a brief summary of the major findings from the first two phases of our study. And now I'd just like to spend some time discussing what they mean and what the implications are. And I've summarised the main discussion points on this slide, but I would just like to take a minute to talk through them in a little more detail. So we can see in the results that I've outlined in this talk how the UK's school closures created conditions which were likely to exacerbate existing inequalities in science capital among primary age children. This is because the move to home learning made teaching science disproportionately difficult in areas of high deprivation, and that was due to the concerns that we've outlined previously about internet access, resource availability, parental ability to support learning. And so for children in these areas whose only contact with science learning was previously through the school, there was a significant risk that this content would dwindle away during lockdown, and many were still being set no science at all, even during the second round of school closures. However, for some parents with existing science capital, home learning proved to be a time to explore different aspects of the discipline together or with members of the extended family. And some of our parental cohort, who as a group had relatively high science capital, described undertaking activities at home that were really beyond the scope of anything that the primary classroom could offer. It's important to stress that it's not the case that all parents had time for such pursuits, as many, of course, found themselves working from home. However, we did identify a distinct subset of families where there was both the knowledge and the time to explore science together with their children during lockdown. It is evident, therefore, that among the many societal harms arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, an exacerbation of existing inequalities in who can access science education and careers may have emerged in the UK. Children who had high science capital in 2019, likely to be more affluent and with science experienced parents, often found that their school was able to provide some science education remotely and may have been supported in extracurricular activities by their parents. That group of children, therefore, were able to continue to build their science capital. By contrast, young people who had low science capital in 2019, maybe those living in more deprived areas or with parents with no experience of post-compulsory science, may have found that their sole science experience, that provided by school, was suddenly removed. Parents, meanwhile, may have been unable to provide the resources needed for home science activities, or simply not known where to start. For these pupils, their sole opportunity to build science capital, that afforded by the school, simply disappeared. The children with existing high science capital, therefore, are likely to be emerging from the pandemic with an even greater advantage than they started with. And this matters particularly with this age group because science attitudes and motivations are set at a young age, meaning that we need to act fast to address this issue. And I'd like to spend my last few minutes saying a few more words about this. So there may be a tendency among policymakers to assume that as long as numeracy and literacy are brought up to speed, other academic subjects can be dealt with over the longer term. However, the situation in science merits a greater degree of urgency. Large-scale UK studies, such as the Aspire study that I reference in this slide, have found that young people's attitudes towards science, and by extension their propensity to pursue post-compulsory science education or careers, are largely fixed by the age of 10 or the last year of primary school. So emerging dichotomies in science capital formation among primary age children, as detailed in this presentation, must therefore be tackled as a matter of urgency. We can't leave it until secondary school. That window will be closed. Of course, different nations will have experienced the pandemic in educationally distinct ways, and different pressures will have emerged. However, in countries which have experienced the problematic science trends that we see in the UK, there is a potentially valuable role for informal educators, such as science museums. And it's well documented that informal science events can boost both factual and effective learning, increasing excitement and interest, as well as knowledge. And a visit to a science museum at this particular moment could provide the spark that brightens a wavering science flame in a 10-year-old child whose education has been ravaged by the pandemic. If there was ever a time for science museums to put all their energy into reaching out to less advantaged groups of younger people, it's now. And if that visit could be bolstered by providing the teacher with related classroom activities, so much the better. A carefully targeted travel subsidy could mean that a school whose children have experienced no hands-on science for 18 months can suddenly provide those pupils with a rich experience. And if that visit can suggest to our 10-year-old that there is a realistic route for them to pursue a career in science in the future, we're adding a little fuel to their flame. As the next year progresses, and my group will continue to talk to families and educators, the scale of the problem outlined in this paper will become clearer, and further measures can be suggested to reverse a worrying tendency. But for the present, the best advice for all informal science educators is to reach out to the younger children from deprived communities near you. They need you right now. Right, well, thank you so much for your attention today, and of course I will be delighted to be available to answer any questions that you may have. But I'd just like to point you to a couple of places where you can get some more information about our study. So we've published 2 peer-reviewed papers on this, information that I've given you today. Paper 1, Widening the Divide, the impact of school closures on primary science learning. That's been published in SN Social Sciences, and that details the findings of phase 1 of our research in closure period 1. And then paper 2, It Just Isn't a Priority, Will Primary Science Learning Loss Be Forgotten?, has been published in the Journal of Emergent Science, and that details our phase 2 findings, including what happened to science teaching and learning during the second school closure period, and also what's been done so far to catch up in science. I'd also be delighted to hear from anybody who's been interested in this talk today, so please feel free to get in touch with me. You can see my email there, ccanovan@uclan.ac.uk, or you can find me on Twitter. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.